Yeah,
I think we can start. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our session on cloud, and more specifically, our session on cloud, is it a free lunch? My name is Liesl Bebb-McKay, and I'm from the BBD European team, and I'm privileged to be joined by our team of cloud experts, Matthew Barnard, Russell Davidson, Dieter Rosch, and Ricardo Pinto, who will be sharing some experience in their worlds of implementing cloud solutions within some of our clients. Cloud is such a hot topic, isn't it? It's something we read about. It's the topic of so many conferences, and it's important for us in business to understand how this topic really relates to the way we operate, as well as to get enough information to be able to make the best decision on what strategic route we want to follow when it comes to cloud. So let's kick it off. Matthew, we hear so much about cloud transformation, both in the press and at conferences, and about the multitude of great advancements we can gain from doing cloud or going cloud. But what are the most common requests we hear from clients? What are they looking for from a cloud perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Liesl. Yeah, I think, when we're talking to our clients, the cloud platforms and the cloud providers are really promising quite a lot, and there's they're driving a lot of interest in this space. And most businesses and many of our clients globally are really all have a lot of interest in this and really trying to find out more. Our clients at BBD are really range. It ranges from small entrepreneurial organizations to some very large enterprises, with tens of millions of customers. And the projects they're actually working on also is a large range. Sometimes there's small greenfields projects, build it from the ground up, to the really large transformational programs, which are trying to move legacy applications, into a new space. I think the one thing they all have in common is really that they're really seeing that cloud-based technologies are definitely going to play a significant part in their projects now and actually into the future. And they're really looking for certain benefits out of it, and the benefits that our clients are really talking to us about and what they're really looking for really sort of fit into three areas. The first one is really costs. Everybody's talking about costs at the moment. Obviously, with the whole pandemic and everything that's going on, there's a lot of pressure on all companies to reduce their costs, and they really see this and going to the cloud as potentially an option to reduce some of their operational costs. So that's definitely a discussion that's happening. The second thing is obviously around about sort of scalability. The idea of just paying for what you want to and then having scale when you've actually got the bigger client base. So scalability is a question and a benefit that they're really looking for as well. And I think the third point, which clients are talking about, is how do we really make this work in our organization? And do we have the right skills? How do our teams need to change? What do we need to learn? How do we need to adapt? So those are really 3 points that our clients are talking about, and where they see they could potentially have problems or have some benefits as well. So when they sort of see these benefits, the expectation is that there's some sort of free lunch out there on the cloud, that they're going to be getting something for a lot cheaper, maybe a lot faster and that as well. And our clients, many of them are jumping in feet first, and others are just saying, well, where do I really start? But in many cases, people aren't really getting the right benefits that they'd expected or been promised. And I think really that's where, we've been having some good discussions with clients on, what we're seeing and the feedback we've had with our clients and our experiences. So Liesl, I suppose that really sort of summarizes up the view that I'm seeing from clients. So yeah, I think it really sets the discussion.
So I guess that's really what we'll explore deeper over the course of this conversation today. Questions around cost and how that really does play out. Is it really a free lunch? What does scalability mean in the context of cloud? And then how do we practically operationalize an implementation? So let's try to dive a bit deeper into some of these topics then. We've called this talk, Is Cloud a Free Lunch? So cost has to be the first point, Dieter. Is it a free lunch? And are there real cost benefits from embarking on this cloud transformation?
Liesl, I think the short answer is yes. In most cases, the cloud will cost you less. If your workload that you're migrating to the cloud is able to leverage the benefits of the cloud, things like elasticity, like on-demand workload scaling, or even services that are specifically aimed at saving you cost or really giving you a discount, things like AWS Spot instances. then in most cases you will save quite a bit of money, and quite often quite a lot of money. If your workload is such that it can't necessarily leverage these benefits, things like scaling up and down easily, then in most cases you will probably pay roughly the same for cloud as you do for on-prem. But the benefits you get out of the cloud there are significantly more for the same price. You get things like automated backups, for example. You get very easy high availability. You get very easy disaster recovery. All of these things are out of the box in the cloud. So even though you pay the same amount, you typically get much more bang for your buck. And then occasionally there are one or two edge cases where the cloud might actually cost you a bit more. Typically these would be where you are already part of a very expensive multi-year licensing agreement with some software that is not cloud friendly, or occasionally when the workload is just a very difficult workload to move to cloud. But in most cases, I would say for the vast majority of clients, they'll see a significant saving in cost on the cloud.
So maybe there is a little bit of free lunch to be had, but I'm guessing there's some caveats, and it sounds like there's some caveats as to when we can. And it seems that the cost decision needs to be taken into account, comparing apples with apples and looking at the full value of a cloud solution, as opposed to just the implementation costs alone. And we have to look at the upsides and downsides depending on our unique situation in the client. Ricky, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with Dieter, and you see this, we've seen it at clients in the early adoption, you potentially start spending just the same or a bit more, but that is as you learn to adopt cloud-based practices, cost optimization practices, augmenting your workloads and modernizing them to start taking availability of all these feature sets that the cloud offers. It also requires a paradigm shift to start thinking of the cloud as more of a utility, like you would water and lights, right? You don't keep your lights on all the time, otherwise you pay more, you have better providers, you're constantly evaluating and shifting. So you think of it as a utility as opposed to something that is permanently there. Once you shift your mindset, you can really start achieving good cost benefits. And then the other thing is different types of costs. I think about it, that's not just related to typical TOCs and dollars and cents. There's obviously your savings of manually you're having a location for a data center, the manual labor involved in setting up hardware or buying hardware or keeping hardware up to date. But there also is productivity costs, which you can save on. You can move faster, you can POC, you can deliver things at a much more rapid scale should you require to. So there's higher productivity for less potentially, and it's opportunity cost as well. We're able to deliver organizational value or ideas much faster, and so they can deliver to their clients, therefore saving on that cost that would have taken you forever, or upfront cost where you can now deliver much faster. So there is definitely a cost gain to be had across multiple levels, but you must be aware that it's not instantaneous, and you have to evaluate your solution first before embarking on the journey.
So it sounds like, yeah, there are savings to be found if implemented properly, but we may need to do some extra spend in the beginning to get that savings later. So I guess the question then is, with economically tough times as we're facing for many of us now, Russell, was Plater's correct? Do we have to spend money to make money? What have you seen at some of our clients that makes this spend in the beginning more worthwhile?
Yeah, I think lift and shift without optimizing anything is going to be more expensive than the cloud, but you're missing a lot of the hidden benefits. Cloud sort of simplifies and consolidates your ops. All of a sudden, you don't have teams of hardware techies running around keeping the hardware lights on. If you're using a managed database, all of a sudden, you don't need a team of DBAs. Also, there's a lot of stuff that you just get out of the box. Pre-configured security like firewalls that protect you from the internet, application firewalls, which are doing packet sniffing, which are preventing cross-site scripting and SQL injection, just to name a few. And these are all specialist topics that require specialist personnel, and they cost a lot of money, and you just get this for a few dollars a month. And as Dieter said, you get backups and DR at the flick of a switch. 4 nines availability, that's 50 minutes downtime a year. The big corporates are paying hundreds of millions to try and achieve that, and I think a lot of them probably struggle to. You can spin up a data center in literally hours. One of my teams just recently spun up 3 separate data centers effectively. That includes network and firewalls, gateways, and then on top of that, managed Kubernetes on top of on that with a CI/CD pipeline, the whole works, and they can do it in about 2 hours. And then there's startups. When Jeff Bezos started Amazon, he started literally in a garage. These days, a startup can pay a few dollars a month to get the infrastructure, and the OpEx cost, it sort of rises linearly as their revenue grows. And this has obviously allowed for an explosion of innovative startup companies. Back to you, Liesl.
Yeah, so I guess this is true, that getting bang for our buck, as you describe it, it appeals to all of us, and it's really appealing for many to have access to out-of-the-box type of acceleration as you describe it. So there obviously is more than cost to consider when we're deciding on to cloud or not to cloud, as it were. And let's get to that second point we heard you speak about, Matthew, which was scalability. We've heard about hyperscale and megascale, and I have to admit, for someone like me, it gets all totally confusing when we're trying to balance these topics, including understanding what is containerization, transformation, etc. So what exactly are we talking about when we say scaling or scalability in the context of cloud? Perhaps Ricky, you can start us off here.
Scale is a hot topic. Everybody wants to scale as fast as they want. So cloud makes it easy to do this, right? Or easier than it was to do this. You're able to scale up your infrastructure, scale up your workloads to meet the demand of your growing business, which doesn't require a lot of initial effort once it's set up. However, it still doesn't preclude the complexity of scale. You're able to do it, but it doesn't make it any less complex. So what you have to do as an organization is maybe not chase the dragons, maybe not chase all the white papers you see, maybe not try to be the next Netflix, right? And be honest with your scale and be honest about what your requirements are and what your expectation is, and design accordingly. Have scale always in the back of your mind, because that's a good practice, but not necessarily aiming for what we would term hyperscale, because very few companies actually need hyperscale, and therefore avoiding designing over complex initial solutions that actually have the counter effect of adopting cloud. They slow you down, they become complex, they're harder to manage intuitively, they slow adoption effectively, especially in new teams trying to implement this. It's too much to take on. So in my experience, it's easier to always consider scale and how you will do it in the future, but not necessarily try to design the greatest scaling system that ever existed off the bat, because the chances of you achieving that on your first run are very, very slim. And then there's other types of scale to consider. You can't just scale your system. You have to scale your teams, your processes, your practices, your internal cultures. Your old processes do not work anymore at these large scales if you really want to be agile and move fast in the cloud. So that requires restructuring how your teams think, maybe adding new teams, decommissioning old teams, changing of responsibilities. This is all about organizational engineering as well as the actual cloud engineering. You have to organize both architecturally to truly be at scale. But scale still remains elusive and it's extremely complex. And it's not exactly the easiest thing to do in cloud, albeit it's much easier than it was before. I guess it comes down to purists, like what is good, what is fit for purpose, what is over-engineered, what is ivory tower. So you have to be cognizant of all of these. So it's a balancing act versus do we engineer upfront, take the hit, or do we work it into our solution? And it's very contextual, but I've seen too many people fail too many times trying to go too large too quickly.
So I'm hearing that we need to be having an honest assessment of how much we really need to do. And that becomes an important decision as we begin this cloud journey. I know most of us believe that our organizations are very complex and that we probably do need these kind of solutions, but then we could be at risk of over-engineering, as you say, Ricky. So Dieter, are you a purist? What do you see as essential when we are looking at the scalability assessment that our clients need to make?
Liesl, I think, as always, the answer is it depends. It depends on the client. And I think Ricky really hit the nail on the head when he said sometimes there's a lot of upfront work that needs to be done, and sometimes you need to scale with your system. And especially when you throw cloud into the mix, I would say probably my number one tip for enterprises would be start small. In the beginning, the critical things you need are good logging, good monitoring, good transaction tracing, and above all, good security. And then good CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment. Those things are really the building blocks on which you build the rest of your system to scale easily. So focus on those basics first. And then when you have all of that up and running and you get to a point where you really do have mega scale or hyperscale, start building in the more complex things like circuit breakers, like bulkhead patterns. But I've had the same experiences with clients as Ricky, where if they start too early with too much complexity, the dev teams just drown in it initially, and they just never get out of the starting blocks. Start small and grow into it. And then, as with everything, always try and keep things simple. The more complexity you add, the more maintenance there is, and the harder it is to debug and to track down errors.
So there's a couple of themes actually emerging as I'm listening to you all speaking now around, first of all, taking time to understand your business's unique needs, and then technically assessing how cloud meets those needs where they are right now. I know in BBD we often say it's not about the tech and it's more about the best solution. The tech will only get us there. So Russell, I'm sure there are other technical complexities we need to understand outside of just what can cloud do for us. Once we get into the technicality, what is it that you've learned from some of our on the ground implementations?
Yeah, agreeing with Ricky and Dieter, local corporates are not hyperscale. But let's take a bank, say, going from 5,000 branches serving 1 million clients to then self-service on these. And all of a sudden, you've gone from thousands to 1 million terminals. And even though it's not hyperscale, it's mega scale. And it's all communicating to the same legacy backend systems. And something is going to give, and it usually does. So to protect the legacy backends, you create interventions like circuit breakers that trigger when backends start to struggle, multi-tier caches to bring the data closer to the device or the user, in-memory databases, which are actually entire copies of the upstream legacy systems. Most of these patterns are given to us by the hyperscalers. And unfortunately, there isn't a middle ground between sort of n-tier client server, which is where we were, and horizontally autoscaling container orchestration in the cloud, which is where hyperscale is. And the latter, it is complex, running autoscaling microservices on Kubernetes under loads that can peak 100 times higher than your average. And your average is 250 pages per second. It's challenging. The platform can exhibit emergent behavior. In other words, shit happens that you can't predict. I've been in war rooms trying to solve while the platform's up and down like a yo-yo, and the client's screaming at me that my team is guessing, and unfortunately he's correct, and it's quite uncomfortable. So you're left with the learnings of the hyperscalers, using the patterns and tools of the Netflixes and the Googles. And that being said, we've been thankful that they've open sourced all of that. All of that IP is available to use and to learn from. Back to you, Liesl.
So the three things are understanding your business need, assessing how cloud can meet those, and shit happens. I heard some initial thoughts on practically how we can make a best start with the implementation, and some of those will be using these patterns and tools, Russell, to accelerate delivery. So let's continue more on some more practical things once we are getting started on a cloud implementation and how to make this more effective. Dieter, what are some of the things that you've identified in your journey in big cloud implementations that make that operational aspect, once you get going, more successful?
I think my two top tips for someone embarking on their first cloud journey, number one is probably, as I said before, start small, learn the platform, learn the capabilities, and then grow into it. Don't just immediately migrate your biggest, most important system, because you're bound to get hurt and sit in that war room that Russell spoke about. And sort of the other side of that coin is, at the same time, don't be afraid. Don't try and micromanage your teams that are moving to the cloud by trying to limit the number of services that they're able to use, or limit their abilities or their access to the platform. The two things you need to monitor in the cloud are your security and your cost. And within those two parameters, allow your teams to experiment, allow them to learn and to grow. And quite often you'll find that they come up with new, better ideas to do things. And quite often, a lot of that will lead to the innovation and the business agility that Ricky spoke about right in the beginning. So to summarize, I would say my two top points is start small and grow into it. And then, like I said, don't be afraid to experiment.
Yeah, I guess starting small is always a good idea. And I like that idea of taking bite-sized chunks and using that as an approach for continuous learning. Of course, experimentation is everything we're doing in modern day software engineering. But all that experimentation and building has to come with the right team construct. And I guess setting up a team is super important. We have to start with the humans after all. So Ricky, I know you've got strong views on the team construct when it comes to on-the-ground implementation. What would you like to share with us on that?
Yeah, I do have opinions on it, or strong opinions. It's been my experience, at least, or my belief, that typically what happens is they try to pigeonhole these new skill sets that are required, or the new type of people, into the traditional infrastructure teams or the traditional processes that exist in corporates. And I don't believe that is a recipe for success. I believe in the rise or the current rise of what they're starting to call platform teams, as opposed to your infrastructure teams. And a platform team, or a set of people, or a capability, or however you want to call it or structure it, is to deliver a platform to the engineering and the product teams where they can play innovate, but a set standard or an operating model, allowing them to move fast without taking this massive cognitive overhead that they might need to burden themselves with inside your engineering team. That requires a lot of skill, a lot of work, and a lot of attention. And you're putting that on top of your product delivery teams and expecting them to wear both hats without knowing much, which generally lands up, in my experience, to slower output, slower delivery, and then again, not delivering on anything that the cloud promises you. It also leads you down a potential rabbit hole of creating a bit of a mess that you can't wrangle back later on. So I'm a big believer in establishing a platform team and a core capability whose first client is the product teams. They are delivering effectively an API, an abstraction to use whatever cloud platform you're on easily. Again, not to be confused, in my opinion, with DevOps teams. They share some similarities, but they're different. Their approaches are different. The platform team is to provide the capability. The DevOps teams, DevOps practices, whether embedded in the teams themselves or a separate team themselves, are more ad hoc. They provide abstractions. They're all on demand, but they're not actually responsible for delivering a platform end to end, which provides for all the things you need from cradle to grave of an application. So I find the establishment of that especially is important to define effectively what becomes an operating model for the cloud across all the product teams. It might cost initially a bit more. It might be something that's a burden on your current teams if you have to restructure. But I believe that those good principles and those structural foundations put you in good stead going forward, because you will eventually have to pay that price, whether you pay it up front or when you go live. The price is still going to be paid. You cannot avoid it. And then the final thing is, do not underestimate the cognitive overhead that this is. It's yet another thing we need to learn. There's a whole bunch of new tools that are coming out in their droves. The space is still evangelizing. So to just expect this to be all of a sudden incumbent on your current structure or your current trend structure is unfair, as well as naive. You're asking people to take on more responsibility with more power, yet you're burdening them with more work. So you do need to have this consideration to train and provide, again, the structure, but in your organization to actually leverage the cloud properly. Otherwise, you'll see peaks of greatness at the beginning, but you will grind to a halt, in my experience, eventually. So to summarize, you do need a different team or a different skill set, and you do need to relook at the structure of how you approach this delivery.
So right sizing is as important as tooling, and tooling as important as team construct. So we have a whole lot of new frameworks that we've got to consider on all these different angles when we're embarking on a project. But I'm guessing there's also some technical aspects, Russell, that we need to be considering, some engineering principles that need to be considered if we want to be successful once we get to implementation. What are some of your lessons here?
I think one of the most important aspects is to learn from and use people who've been there and done that. And yes, incurred some scars along the way. What I've also noticed, architectural design principles and following them is paramount to success. Especially in something that's auto-scaling and elastic, and you're servicing millions of clients. Programmers around the world, often confronted with the same problem, will often come to the same solution design. And these sort of best designs are what we call design patterns. And there's lots of them available, and make use of the design patterns. And I think another initiative of mine at the moment is to get teams that implement these types of projects to create generic templates of the cloud implementation of that infrastructure, and create that infrastructure as code. Then subsequent teams can just roll out that infrastructure at a flick of a switch. It's more than one switch, but you get the idea. And typically within an hour, you roll out the equivalent of an entire data center, as I mentioned earlier. With your CI/CD pipelines, the whole works. And you can use these sort of templates. For example, you can make a copy of your entire dev environment, and then use that for performance testing for a few hours, and then spin it down again. In the past, there's just no way to do that. Someone had to spend millions on hardware just to even have a testing environment. Back to you, Liesl.
Unmute. So we've discussed some elements around cloud. We've looked at what cloud could mean for you depending on the scale of your business, and then we've looked at a few considerations when actually getting to the implementation. So I hope that's given our listeners a lot to think about, and we'll give you a little bit more to think about before we end off. But in the meantime, there is a Q&A button. So if you do have questions, please feel free to go ahead. There are some coming. They may be answered online, or we may answer them through the conversation. But while I give you time to just look at that Q&A and maybe ask some questions of our panel, maybe we just wrap up by going around the panel one by one and just highlighting the most important consideration. What is your number one tip for people listening right now that they need to bear in mind when embarking on a cloud transformation? So just short and sweet, your one top tip, and we'll start where we start in the beginning. We'll start with Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Liesl. I think, for me is I think, the guys have shared quite a lot of experience today, but it's probably just the tip of the iceberg. with every free lunch, there's definitely some terms and conditions. And I think, you know, that requires obviously more discussion in that. And I think, you know, sharing this knowledge and sharing the experience is really important in that. So for me, I suppose the one takeaway is really about working with people that have experience and sharing that knowledge across our clients and across the community. And so, yeah, that's what I'd say.
Thanks, Matt. Russell, your top tip, short and sweet.
First one, educate your staff. You really need it in this environment. And to reiterate, learn from people who've been there and done that. Lastly, be prepared to experiment, not in production, of course. But the cloud allows you to spin things up and spin them down for a few dollars. Experiment.
Great. Ricky, your top tip.
In line with kind of Russell is don't be afraid to experiment, but know that you will fail. And failure will come, and it will teach you, and you will learn from that, especially if you adopt quickly. All the great success stories we've ever seen, they didn't get it right first out of the box, right? There's massive failure. So you will fail, learn from those failures. Do not try to master them, adopt them, experiment. And personally, keep up to breast. It's an exciting moving space. There's tons of opportunity in it. So pick a section of cloud, pick a tech of cloud, and see if you like it and skill up on it. These skills will be in demand. They are growing in demand, and especially hands-on usage of these skills is going to become incredibly valuable to anybody wishing to make good use of the cloud. Yes, and I think it's the future, well, or it is already here. We might pivot in 10 years from now to somewhere else, but cloud is not going anywhere. It's here to stay. So we definitely need to be prepared from it, whether you have it, using it, or just thinking about starting it. It's coming your way.
It's coming your way. Dieter, what is your top tip?
I thought I gave 2 top tips already.
Who wants another one? We're pushing you.
Yeah, let's go for it. Go for cloud. Cloud is awesome. Cloud is amazing. But seriously, it really is a great enabler for business. But invest in your people. Take the time and the effort to spend the money to send your people on good training. This is a very complex space. It's a brand new space. It's in true hyperscale, it's probably less than 10 years old, although it's probably about 14, 15 years old in total. So really spend the time to and spend the money to invest in your people, send them on the right training, whether it's one of the big public cloud providers or whether it's one of the smaller ones. It will pay off time and time again. If you send your people in there unprepared, not only are they going to fail, it's going to cost you a lot of money and potentially a lot of risk in terms of data leakage, etc. So that would probably be my number 1 tip for people who haven't yet dipped their toes in the pond.
Great. So let's get to some of these questions. The first question is, Dieter, I think you're going to take this one. It's actually a 2-part question. It says, hey team, number 1, how do you go about selling or suggesting a cloud-based solution to clients who have already taken a high CapEx knock to purchase their own on-prem infrastructure? Would you recommend that they just wait until that's at the end of life and fully depreciated, or is there an alternative? Maybe it's hybrid. And then part 2, how do you advise businesses on which cloud provider suits their needs best? Is it all cost data center location based, or does your advice take into account the implementation team capabilities and experience as well? Dieter?
Okay, part 1 of the question. You've already taken a fairly heavy CapEx hit on your existing infrastructure. I would say a hybrid approach is probably the best there. You have to leverage and embrace what you already have. You've set out the money, so you've got to sweat the asset, as they say. With that said, there's a lot of business agility and capability in the cloud that you can still leverage on top of what you already have. As a good example, you can do something like you can use the cloud as a content distribution network, which basically allows you, even if your data center is, for example, in Ireland, but your user base is in South Africa, you can move all of the static web content close to your clients, or all of the video content, for example, very close to your clients, which will give them a much better user experience. Also bear in mind that with the cloud, you're not limited to a particular region. So you can essentially have a worldwide distributed data center, even if the heart of it still sits in South Africa or in Ireland or in Brazil. So I would say, and just another way to approach it, you can consider something like putting your dev environments into the cloud first. This gives you a lot of agility in being able to spin up new dev environments when you need them, kill them again when you don't. It's a very nice space for doing demos for clients. It's a really nice space for experimenting. Then part 2 of the question, how do you advise businesses on which cloud provider suits them? Is it all cost data center location based, or does it take into account the implementation team? This is a question we get fairly often. And it's very much client dependent. If you're very much a, I'm going to use the example of a very Microsoft heavy company where your entire stack is based on Microsoft, Azure will probably be an easier move for you. There's better integration with your existing tool set. You will very easily find your way around the Azure tool set because it's built with a Microsoft mindset in mind. So your people will have an easier migration. If you tend to be, if your company is a bit more Unix based, you have lots of Linux backends and a lot of web front ends. AWS, in my experience, is slightly more Linux friendly, so I would probably go AWS in that case. With that said, you need to understand that the managed services that all of these cloud providers offer, especially the large ones, are very much on par. If you find a managed service, a managed database, for example, in the one cloud provider, you will also find it in the other. Where the difference tends to come in is in the small print. Obviously, if you're a Microsoft SQL Server user, you will likely find it significantly cheaper per month on Azure because they bought the licensing in there. If you typically run on something like Postgres or MySQL, you will probably find that it's either very much the same cost, or in some cases you'll find some cloud providers a bit cheaper. But you have to take into account, and this again dovetails with what Ricky said earlier about having the right teams and the right people. You absolutely have to take into account your current tech stack, your future strategic tech stack, and your people's capabilities. There is no one size fits all for this.
I can add to that a little bit if you don't mind. For the first one, if you've got a large on-prem, this doesn't actually preclude you from starting to build a cloud-native solution. In fact, there is a lot of tooling and a lot of get ready, as I suppose. Take some common cloud-native platforms that you'd run in public cloud, say Kubernetes. There's no prerequisite to run in the cloud. You can get yourself ready. You can build this on your own tin, such that when the time can and you have sweated the asset, you are perfectly ready to go. You have done the groundwork, you have thought about your architecture, and you're basically just moving into the cloud. So that, whether you want to consider that hybrid, but I consider that there's nothing precluding you from preparing yourself to again, organize your teams, organize your operations, pick your tool sets and implement them where you can on your current infrastructure. There's nothing you precluding from doing that. Furthermore, most of these tools are free, depending how you want. You don't have to have a managed service, although it's advised, but it's not essential. And the final thing is, in terms of cloud, like as Dieter mentioned, most of them on the basics have feature parity, but it's also, again, depends on what you're looking to. I personally find Google's GCP to be a better big data stack. That's where they're mastered. Google Azure seems to, in my opinion, have a better BI capability, for example, tech. AWS seems to have a feature every day. that's new, that can tackle something. So it also depends on the workload that will provide you best bang for buck. And as for hybrid cloud, I think the biggest hybrid cloud is extremely complex. It's still a phase that's coming. I don't think it's a thing you can embark on lightly, unless cost is a massive, massive concern to you, where you can basically pick and choose your cloud provider based on cost. But yeah, if you have big tin, doesn't stop you. If you have your own tin, doesn't stop you from getting ready for cloud or building in a cloud native way.
Thanks, Ricky and Dieter. Russell, I see Wayne is asking AWS or Azure, which is best. I think Dieter went into some of that, but let's hear a bit more. Who'd you choose?
Yeah, I guess it's like the same question as, is Java better than C# or Oracle versus SQL Server? Excuse me, I got a frog. Yeah, there's going to be evangelists for both and detractors for both, and for most corporate workloads, it's going to be much of a muchness, to be honest. There will be specific use cases that work better on one versus the other, as per Dieter and Ricky as well. But for the most part, it's much of a muchness. You can, of course, design your application to be cloud agnostic. If you put your workload into Kubernetes, it'll translate to either. And there's various other platforms out there that sort of abstract you away from the actual cloud implementation itself.
Okay, Wayne, I hope we've answered your question satisfactorily. And that's it on the questions for today. So we can go ahead and wrap up the session and say thanks to our panelists for some really great insights. I hope that all our listeners out there have got something valuable and some pointers that can help them in their cloud journey. And we wish you great success in your implementation going forward. Thanks and goodbye.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.